So today I want to discuss something that almost nobody in the Western press is taking seriously. Everyone is focused on North Korea's missiles, on Taiwan, on what China might do in the next 5 years. But today I want to ask a completely different question. I want to ask what happens when the most disciplined, most rules-following, most alliance-loyal country in East Asia quietly decides that the rules no longer protect it. I am talking about South Korea. And I want to be precise about what I mean, because the word nuclear gets used in ways that obscure more than they reveal. I am not saying South Korea is about to test a weapon tomorrow. I am not saying it has secretly assembled a warhead in a basement somewhere. What I am saying is something more important and more consequential than either of those things. What I am saying is that South Korea has spent the last decade building every component of nuclear weapons capability except the final act of assembling one, and that the political will to cross that last line is growing faster than Washington is prepared to admit. That is a different kind of threat, and it is in many ways a more interesting kind of threat, because it does not come from an adversary, it comes from an ally. And Washington has no idea how to stop an ally who has decided quietly and methodically that its survival requires capabilities the alliance was never designed to provide. Let me start with something most people do not know about South Korea's history. In 1974, the Park Chung-hee government secretly initiated a program to develop nuclear weapons. Park was not a reckless man. He was calculating, methodical, and deeply aware of what had happened to countries that depended entirely on American security guarantees that might not hold. He watched what happened in Vietnam. He watched American domestic politics turn against overseas commitments. And he looked at the Korean Peninsula and made a rational decision. South Korea needed its own deterrent. The program was real. The scientists were working. The procurement networks were being assembled. And then the United States found out. And the pressure that followed was so intense, so sustained, and so threatening to the entire bilateral relationship that Park eventually shut it down. Not because he believed South Korea did not need the capability, but because the cost of pursuing it openly was higher than he was willing to pay at that moment. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 1974, a South Korean president looked at the American security guarantee, ran the numbers, and concluded it was not enough. And that was before North Korea had a single functioning nuclear warhead. That was before North Korea had demonstrated the ability to place a re-entry vehicle on an ICBM capable of reaching American cities. The calculus Park was running in 1974 was far more favorable to trusting the alliance than the calculus that Seoul is running today. That is where this story begins, not in some future crisis, in a decision that was made and then suppressed 50 years ago, and that has never stopped being relevant. Now, let me explain what nuclear latency actually means, because this concept is the key to everything that follows. A country has nuclear latency when it possesses the technical capacity to build a nuclear weapon within a specific time window if it chose to do so. The window matters. A country that could build a weapon in 10 years has low latency. A country that could build one in 6 months has very high latency. A country that could build one in 6 to 12 months, depending on how much it is willing to signal its intentions during the process, is in a category that strategic analysts call nuclear threshold status. Japan is sometimes described this way. South Korea is described this way too, though more quietly. Here is what South Korea has as of right now. It has 26 operating nuclear reactors, making it one of the most nuclear sophisticated civilian energy programs on the planet. It has indigenous uranium enrichment research, curtailed by its 123 agreement with the United States, but never fully dismantled in terms of institutional knowledge. It has approximately 50 kilograms of separated plutonium, acknowledged in official disclosures. It has a ballistic missile program that has been steadily extended and upgraded, with missiles now capable of reaching every significant target on the Korean Peninsula and well beyond. It has a defense industrial base that builds submarines, fighter aircraft, destroyers, and cruise missiles. and it has, by virtually every independent estimate, the scientific and engineering workforce required to complete weaponization in somewhere between 6 months and 2 years if the political decision were made. Let me say that again, 6 months to 2 years. That is not a distant theoretical ambition. That is a political decision away from reality. And here is the question that should follow from that immediately. Why hasn't it happened? What is actually stopping South Korea from crossing that line? The conventional answer is the alliance. The United States guarantees South Korean security under Article 5. American troops are stationed on Korean soil. Extended deterrence, meaning the American nuclear umbrella, covers South Korea. If North Korea launches a nuclear strike, the United States will retaliate on South Korea's behalf. That is the formal architecture. That is what the treaty says. That is what the strategy documents assert. And for 40 years, that framework was sufficient to keep South Korean strategic culture inside the alliance's boundaries. But something has been changing, and it has been changing in ways that are structural, not anecdotal. It is not about one speech or one poll. It is about a shift in the underlying logic that South Korean strategists use to evaluate their situation. And that shift did not begin with any single event. It began accumulating the moment North Korea demonstrated something that strategic analysts had long feared, but hoped to delay almost indefinitely. In 2017, North Korea tested an intercontinental ballistic missile that on at least 2 occasions demonstrated re-entry vehicle characteristics consistent with the ability to strike the continental United States. Let me be precise. The technical debate about North Korean ICBM reliability continues among experts, and there are real questions about warhead miniaturization, re-entry vehicle hardening, and second strike survivability. But the political impact of those 2017 tests did not wait for the technical debate to conclude. What the tests communicated to Seoul was a possibility that strategic planners had known was coming, but that became suddenly, viscerally real in a new way. If North Korea can threaten American cities, then the American nuclear umbrella may have a hole in it. The hole is called decoupling, and it is the oldest and most serious problem in extended deterrence theory. The question is simple. If North Korea fires a nuclear weapon at Seoul and then threatens to fire one at Los Angeles if Washington retaliates, does Washington retaliate? Does it trade Los Angeles for Seoul? Can an American president, in the moment that question is actually on the table, make that commitment credibly? Extended deterrence works only if the adversary believes the guarantor will actually follow through. In the moment an adversary acquires the ability to threaten the guarantor directly, the credibility of that follow-through becomes at minimum uncertain. Uncertain. That word has enormous consequences in nuclear strategy because deterrence does not require certainty. It requires sufficiency. But the threshold of sufficiency is not fixed. It rises as the cost of the guarantee rises. And when North Korea pointed missiles at American cities, it raised the cost of the American guarantee dramatically. South Korean strategists know this. They have known it for years. And the public polling reflects what the strategists know. Surveys conducted by the Chicago Council and by Korean domestic polling firms consistently show that somewhere between 60 and 77% of South Koreans support the development of an indigenous nuclear deterrent. That is not a fringe position. That is a majority position in a democracy, and democracies eventually produce politicians who reflect majority positions. Here is where I want to introduce what I think is the counterintuitive piece of this analysis. Most observers in Washington frame this as a proliferation problem. South Korea going nuclear would break the NPT, would trigger a cascade in Japan, would undermine the entire global non-proliferation architecture. That framing treats South Korean nuclearization as a failure to be prevented. But there is an entirely different way to read what is actually happening. And this is the framing that I think explains the last 5 years of South Korean behavior far more accurately. South Korea is not trying to build a bomb. South Korea is trying to tell Washington something. And it is doing so in the only language that Washington's strategic culture fully understands: capability. The logic works like this. If South Korea demonstrates that it is within 6 months of a weapon, that it has the technical pieces assembled and the political support latent and the industrial base ready, then it has created leverage. It has given Washington something to lose. Washington's interest in non-proliferation is enormous, institutionally, politically, historically. The moment South Korea becomes a credible threshold state, Washington's incentive to offer a more credible extended deterrence arrangement increases dramatically. The threat to proliferate becomes the bargaining chip for a better deal. And South Korea is, historically and institutionally, one of the most sophisticated users of alliance leverage anywhere in the world. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require secret meetings or covert instructions. It is a structural dynamic. Politicians respond to capability and public pressure. The South Korean defense establishment has been steadily advancing every component of nuclear capability short of weaponization. The political conversation has moved from taboo to routine. The public support is documented and growing. The trajectory is visible, and Washington is watching it and making calculations about what it needs to offer to keep South Korea inside the line. The Washington Declaration of April 2023 was one result of that calculation. The Nuclear Consultative Group, established under that declaration, gives South Korea a seat in discussions about how and when American nuclear assets might be used in scenarios involving the Korean Peninsula. It is not a NATO-style nuclear sharing arrangement. It is not a veto, but it is substantially more than what existed before. And it exists precisely because South Korean strategic pressure made the status quo politically unsustainable. I might be wrong about the precise mechanism. This is not prophecy. This is structural analysis. But the pattern is consistent with how alliance bargaining has worked in every major American alliance since the Cold War. The ally that credibly threatens to pursue independent capability extracts the largest concessions from Washington. France tested its own weapon and became a permanent fixture of Western strategic culture on its own terms. West Germany chose not to test, but extracted the most elaborate nuclear sharing infrastructure NATO ever built. South Korea is following a version of the same logic, adapted to its specific institutional and diplomatic constraints. Now I want to make 3 observations about how this is likely to develop over the next decade, because I think understanding the trajectory matters as much as understanding the present moment. The first observation is this: the constraint is political, not technical. And political constraints erode under sustained pressure in ways that technical constraints do not. Right now, the thing stopping South Korea from crossing the line is the 1-2-3 agreement, the NPT obligation, and the alliance relationship with Washington. All 3 of those constraints are weaker than they were 10 years ago. The 1-2-3 agreement is subject to renegotiation. NPT withdrawal requires 6 months' notice, a legally straightforward process, however politically costly. And the alliance relationship has already demonstrated, through multiple American administrations, that it is subject to transactional renegotiation in ways that would have been unthinkable in 1980. The constraints are real, but they are softening, and they will continue to soften as long as the underlying security environment deteriorates. The second observation is this: Japan is watching. Every decision South Korea makes about nuclear threshold status recalibrates what is politically possible for Tokyo. Japan has its own latency, arguably even greater than South Korea's, given its plutonium stockpiles, its space launch capability, and its reactor program. Japan has its own public that is slowly shifting on questions that were settled for 70 years. If South Korea moves visibly toward the line, Japan's political conversation accelerates. And if Japan's conversation accelerates, the entire non-proliferation order in East Asia enters a dynamic that is genuinely difficult to reverse. Washington understands this. It is part of why the pressure on Seoul is so sustained and so institutional. Stopping South Korea is not just about South Korea. It is about a cascade that neither Washington nor anyone else has a clear plan to manage. The third observation is this: North Korea's trajectory is not reversible by any realistic diplomatic scenario currently on the table. North Korea has tested somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 missiles since 2011. It has conducted 6 nuclear tests. It has built a program that by most independent assessments now includes somewhere between 40 and 80 warheads, with production continuing. There is no sanctions regime that has slowed this program in any meaningful way. There is no diplomatic channel currently active that has any credible path to denuclearization. What this means is that the threat driving South Korean public opinion and South Korean strategic planning is not going away. It is growing. And as it grows, the internal political pressure to match it does not diminish. It compounds. I want to be honest about what I do not know. I do not know whether South Korea will ultimately decide to cross the line. I do not know whether some future diplomatic breakthrough might change the calculation. I do not know exactly what is discussed in the most sensitive bilateral consultations between Seoul and Washington, the conversations that do not produce press releases. Strategic decisions of this magnitude happen inside closed rooms, and the full picture is never available to the outside analyst. What I am offering is a structural reading of the incentives, the capabilities, the historical pattern, and the trajectory. And the structural reading says the pressure is building, the capability is advancing, and the political will is growing. The honest truth is that Washington's ability to stop this is declining. Not because Washington lacks leverage, it still has substantial leverage, but because the nature of the leverage is changing. For decades, Washington could credibly threaten to withdraw the security guarantee if South Korea pursued indigenous capability. That threat worked because the security guarantee was South Korea's primary protection. But the more South Korea doubts the credibility of that guarantee, the less effective the threat to withdraw it becomes. You cannot credibly threaten to remove something the other party is already preparing to replace. What Washington can do is offer a better guarantee, more credible, more institutionalized, more responsive to South Korean concerns about decoupling. The Nuclear Consultative Group is a step in that direction. Whether it is a sufficient step is a question that neither party has publicly answered, because neither party wants to force the question into the open before the answer is ready. The negotiation is happening. It is just not happening in public. Every empire that has tried to manage nuclear proliferation among its allies has eventually discovered the same thing. You cannot prevent an ally from seeking capability if the ally has concluded that the capability is necessary for survival. You can delay. You can negotiate. You can offer alternatives. But if the underlying security environment keeps deteriorating, and if the credibility of the guarantee keeps eroding, the logic of proliferation eventually becomes stronger than the logic of restraint. This has happened before. It is not a unique dynamic. It is a pattern that repeats across alliance systems and across decades. South Korea is not unique in facing this logic. What is unique is how carefully, how methodically, and how quietly it has positioned itself to act on that logic when the moment arrives. That patience is itself a message, and it is a message that Washington, whatever it says publicly, has already begun to receive. The graveyard of empires is patient. The graveyard of alliance systems is patient too. It does not demand a decision today. It simply waits for the conditions that make the decision inevitable. And the question that no one in Washington's strategic community wants to answer out loud is whether those conditions are already here or merely on their way. This is not prophecy. It is game theory and structural history. Question it, test it, think for yourself.